Hey guys, this is Matt coming to you from London, where I'll be finishing up my PhD in the next year or two, writing my thesis. I'll be teaching, organizing a seminar this fall. Another thing I'm going to be doing is more History Speaks content. As I tweeted out the other day, I have several debates in the horizon. Specifically, I'm going to be debating white genocide, a guy who believes this is happening. I'm going to say it isn't. I'm going to also say that anti-white discrimination is real, but that this is a false and destructive meme. I'm going to be debating the Israel-Palestine conflict on the side of the Palestinians, and I'm going to be publishing a review of Richard Hanania's book on woke. So I'm also interested in debating the origins of World War II with maybe a guy like Mark Webber. I haven't contacted him yet, but I think that could be interesting. Today I'm going to talk about the Islam debate of the 2000s and early to mid-2010s. This discussion is going to be based on a thread I did the other day that proved to be way too long for Twitter. It was like 52 tweets. My thought on writing the thread, and today still, is that this debate deserves to be revisited because I actually believe the Islam debate helped bring about the woke era. Today we're going to discuss the history of the debate and critique both sides of it. The analogy between the Islam debate of the 2000s and the 2010s, between guys like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, as well as religious critics of Islam like Robert Spencer. Really, I'm talking about a Western debate, not a debate within the Islamic world. But the analogy between this debate and today's debate on racial or ethnic issues of woke versus anti-woke is quite remarkable. Today on public discussions of sensitive issues of race, religion, ethnicity, like race and crime, as you're seeing here, the anti-woke offer a highly slanted version, what is nevertheless a real truth. The anti-woke have their own biases, which I'll talk about, but as you can see with this chart, African Americans have a much higher per capita homicide rate than other ethnic groups, and this is something that the anti-woke people emphasize. A lot of the anti-woke people, not all, but a lot of the anti-woke, not me, I'm anti-woke, but promote this idea of an epidemic of black violence against whites. So they have these videos where white people are being beaten up and so on. So the videos are real in many cases, but they're trying to create this broader narrative that high rates of crime in the black community are victimizing whites, and this isn't true. The high crime rates in the black community, as you can see from these data, overwhelmingly victimize other blacks. Of course, it's a problem. It's not a problem of blacks victimizing whites. My view is that anti-woke have a lot of problems and biases. The woke are just completely useless, essentially. They have no willingness at all to substantively engage politically sensitive matters and race and ethnicity. They just cry foul, racist, try to get you fired, stigmatize people, and so on. That's straight from the party line. And kind of derangement, inability to engage. Pattern I talked about just now regarding crime rates in the African American community kind of reflects a core pattern. On the anti-woke side, you have kernels of truth, but you have overstatement and politically motivated distortion. On the woke side, you can't even discuss the subject honestly at all. You just scream and engage in personal attacks, try to cancel, and so on. This dynamic, the problematic woke side and the problematic anti-woke side, was on full display in the Islam debate. The anti-woke side of the Islam debate was pushed by two main bodies. First, popular neoconservative pundits, not like neocon intellectuals, but popular pundits like Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Mark Levine, also people like Brigitte Gabriel, who's a Lebanese Christian, as is Jean Pirro. So you had some Christian Middle Eastern people as well who were kind of riding this wave. You also had, though, liberal kind of atheistics or secular intellectuals like the movement of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens, who were adamant, tireless critics of Islam. You also had ex-Muslims, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who really provided a more sympathetic treatment in the context of our culture, because you're seeing this intelligent black woman, in the case of Ayaan, Somali woman, who can give a personal account of how Islamic law brutalized her in her upbringing. That was a powerful rhetorical weapon they had, these ex-Muslims, and these people were, by all means, sincere. I'm not trying to demean them. These guys in the Islam debate, the anti-woke side, I'll describe broadly. So it's secular liberals, new atheists, ex-Muslims, neocons, so on. They made two core claims. First, that values held by Muslims are radically incompatible with the values of Western secularism. And they also argued that the contemporary Islamic doctrine of jihad is strongly supportive of terrorism against the West. So not all, not most, but enough that there are national security risks. So these doctrines are highly conducive to violence. Let's take these two statements. The first statement, which is that Islam is incompatible with the West and Western secular liberalism, there's a lot of truth to it, but it is an overstatement. The second assertion, that these doctrines are highly conducive to violence against Westerners in the modern age, this is a colossally irresponsible exaggeration. First, let's consider the first assertion, which is incompatibility of Islam and secular liberalism. It cannot seriously be denied that traditional Sunni Islam, as expressed by the positions of the four schools of jurisprudence on fiqh and their interpretation of the Sunnah and the Quran, they endorse a slew of policies such as the execution of apostates, stoning of adulterers under rare circumstances, that you can meet the evidentiary burden, but nevertheless, that's still prescribed punishment, no denying it. These kind of things, homosexuality, male homosexuality, sodomy, luat, they'd call it death, or depending on your school of jurisprudence, death or another punishment, criminalization, if not death. These values are wildly incompatible with Western secular liberalism, notions of autonomy and choice, and so on. Still, this argument that Islam is compatible with liberalism is flawed because it assumes traditional Islam, as represented by the Thor schools of jurisprudence, is the only game in town, or at least the only form of Islam with widespread indigenous support in the Muslim world. As Sam Harris put it, Islam is all fringe and no center. That was a famous quote. By the way, he's good at language, even though I think he's a problematic thinker in many ways. I like his views on free will, but I think he has some sloppiness. All fringe, no center is what Harris says, and the problem with that it's assuming traditional Islam, the four schools of jurisprudence, these punishments I talked about, is the only game in town, the only thing Muslims believe. So to get a glimpse of how lots of Muslims reject these interpretations from the schools of jurisprudence, from traditional Sunni Islam, let's look at the famous Pew polls on the political opinions of the world's Muslims. This is something Sam Harris always liked to cite, as did Bill Maher. And the reason they like to cite it is because it reveals attitudes, support for theocracy and corporal punishment and so on that shock Western sensibilities and were the large majority in many Muslim countries. What was strangely overlooked, and is more interesting to me, really, as somebody who focuses maybe on the historical sense, look at Sunni Islam and what they thought about criminal justice and so on, is how the same polls reveal in many other Muslim countries, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Albania, and so on, the vast majority of people want secularism, not Islamic law. So you have huge important countries like Turkey where support for secularism is the vast majority of the population. There isn't just one Islam and then cotton candy Islam. There are significant different interpretations as important as the four schools of jurisprudence. These polls ironically contradict Harris's narrative of an incorrigible conflict between Islamic and Western secular liberalism. In fact, cultural changes can lead Muslims to adapt to a secular mode of civilization. The anti-woke side of the Islam debate was correct about an extreme incompatibility between traditional Sunni Islam and secular liberalism on the other. The problem with these guys, their narrative, is they overlooked all the other Islams that have great resonance in the Islamic world, not just in Western countries, that pose no such conflict. What about the second argument that the anti-Islam advocates made about jihadism? There's no question that Muslims have waged terrorism against Western nations. The anti-Muslim body was wrong to see this as a plain application of Islamic doctrine or somehow mainstream or representative of Muslims. Let's talk about doctrine first. Virtually all scholars of Islam, the ulama, they reject jihadist terrorism. And in fact, they believe jihad can only be defensive. If you're skeptical of this, if you know about the Islamic conquest, just bear with me for a second. So traditional Islamic fiqh certainly recognizes the legitimacy of waging offensive war to spread the faith. However, this form of jihad can only be practiced at the discretion of the caliph. All these conditions I won't get into, but it does absolutely require the existence of a caliphate. ISIS was an interesting case because ISIS sought to revive the caliphate, called itself a caliphate, and thereby it revived the concept of offensive jihad. Offensive jihad is no longer a legitimate Islamic concept, according to mainstream conservative Islamic scholars. Even these guys, who attacked the Twin Towers, they claim at least that offensive jihad is not valid. They claim that they're acting defensively. So there's a form of jihad that's defensive, and that does not require the caliphate. If you read bin Laden's 1998 declaration of jihad against the United States, he's making an argument for defensive jihad. So he's not saying that they have a right to attack the United States offensively. He's saying that in practice, but he at least has to have a wrapper of defense, because of this normative Islamic view that offensive jihad is not applicable in today's age because there's no caliphate. So you may say, oh, that's such a huge stretch. He's waging offensive war in the West. That proves that, regardless of what he says, that offensive jihad is still valid. Well, I mean, think of how often people spin offensive invasions. Here's one example, Aaron Mate. To be entirely clear for Aaron Mate, he claims that the war was wrong and there's a crime and so on, but it's quasi-defensive. He had, in fact, told me in a call he wouldn't call it aggression. What's important in this regard, too, is that almost all Muslims around the world rejected bin Laden, from Salafis in Saudi Arabia to secular Kemalists in Turkey. The anti-Islam crowd, frankly, and irresponsibly exaggerated the terrorist threat from the Muslim world. It's a real threat, needs to be dealt with militarily, but they exaggerated the level of support for this in normative Islamic doctrine and among regular Muslim people. While the anti-woke side of the Islam debate overstated its case and glossed over essential nuance. The other side of the debate was in another league altogether, the woke side. They were aggressively dishonest and obscurantist while relishing in character assassination of the other side. The tactics of the liberal obscurantists, who wanted to reduce all concerns about Islamic belief and doctrine to a question of racism, were a preview of the woke tactics we see today in all sensitive discussions about race, ethnicity, and diversity. We had many outrageous charlatans in this discourse, and maybe the most outrageous of them was Reza Aslan. Aslan contended that Islamic scripture was nothing but words on a page. The values derived from the Quran and Sunnah were just an expression of the individual reading the book. This idea is absurd, that it's just a purely individualistic thing. Aslan must have known that he was being dishonest. Under traditional Sunni Islam, followed by the vast majority of Muslims in many countries, many interpretive claims are deemed uncontroversial. This would include, for example, the claim that the Quran condemns homosexuality. This is an important concept in the religion, that if you depart from these matters known by necessity, you are outside the fold of Islam. So, in other words, individual interpretation is radically circumscribed according to traditional Sunni Islam. Rejecting such interpretive claims, by the way, claims that are known by necessity in Islam, is apostasy according to traditional Islam, which is no small offense given that apostasy is a capital offense in many Muslim countries. Yet, Aslan, with the intent of obscuring Muslim doctrine, claimed over and over again that Muslims just live in a world of interpretive anarchy and was completely dishonest. The fact that he was able to get away with this narrative, which is absurd, is just remarkable. We also had other scholars like Juan Cole who played a similar game, like promoting a cotton candy version of Islam. He said one of his aims was to discredit the anti-Islam narrative pushed by Harris and his ilk. I don't know if he actually said that explicitly, to be fair, but he did call out Harris and was in this discourse. Cole wrote a book called Muhammad, Prophet of Peace, and he rejected the whole pre-modern Islamic scholarly corpus, the normative hadith collections, and as well as the earliest Arab biographies of Muhammad. His treatment of Muhammad's life just ignored all the traditional sources, because they say things like Muhammad had concubines or whatever. They say things that can't square with his prophet of peace vision. Cole adopted an anachronistic interpretation of Muhammad's career. He absurdly equated the prophet's conquest of Mecca in 630 to Martin Luther King's I-63 March in Washington. So he's kind of a pacifist. He doesn't wage offensive war. You get this cotton candy version of him. He was, again, in this woke tier that was just very low caliber, blatantly politically motivated. In addition to academics, journalists and popular commentators and influencers play a big role in pushing the woke side of the Islam debate. Glenn Greenwald, interestingly, an openly gay leftist who achieved fame by his publication of the Edward Snowden NSA documents, was very active in this debate, implying or stating that people were racists who had critiques of Islam and so on. He was a very bad actor in this space. Greenwald endorsed the claim from Murtaza Hussain that criticism of Islam was an heir to scientific racism. So very woke Glenn was at that time. Bizarrely, Greenwald has in recent years reemerged as a MAGA pundit, an ally of Tucker Carlson. Turned out Tucker Carlson was recorded saying terribly racist things about Muslim peoples, like calling Iraqis primitive monkeys. Glenn Greenwald gave like a half-hearted criticism and just dropped the matter. It's pretty clear at this point Glenn's foray into this space was pretty disingenuous. Another important voice in the woke end of the Islam debate was Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks. Uygur, by the way, is an ex-Muslim from Istanbul. As we saw earlier, being a Muslim from Turkey, where close to 90% of people want secular law, would be a different experience than an ex-Muslim from Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or whatever. Uygur insisted that any singling out of Islam for criticism was suspect, and that the problem was only, quote, religious fundamentalism, unquote, in general. The problem with this reasoning is that Islamic fundamentalists support theocracy, while Christian fundamentalists usually support religious freedom, free speech, and democracy, opposing gay marriage, which basically everyone in the world did 30 years ago. In sum, there was no real winner in the Islam debate. Both sides were pretty crass, and neither side, I don't think, persuaded many people. I have to say the woke side was worse in that they were just totally out of touch with reality, whereas the anti-woke side of the Islam debate, the guys like Sam Harris, they were like blind men touching the elephant, but at least they were touching a real thing. What's important about the debate is that it set the stage for the woke model of discourse on controversial issues related to race, ethnicity, and diversity. Even though it didn't persuade people, it was a premonition in some way. As a coda, I think it's worth discussing contemporary public opinion in America on Islam. While the Muslim community in America, and indeed the Anglo-American world more generally, was pretty passive in the face of the rise of gay marriage, the recent woke campaign to introduce LGBT-positive education to very young children in public schools provoked a huge Muslim backlash. In America, Canada, the United Kingdom, Muslim men and women have spoken at school board meetings, lobbied electoral officials, and marched in large protests, advocating a right for their children to opt out of this kind of new, very aggressive LGBT curricula. This activism has drawn the praise of many conservatives. Laura Ingraham, who was actually in this debate, the earlier debate, one of the more crass voices, is kind of an anti-Muslim polemicist, have actually recently publicly praised the Muslims for stepping up on this issue. On the left side of things, public officials have attacked the Muslim community for what they consider to be a reactionary position. This lady accused Muslims of adopting like white supremacist talking points, which is pretty funny. Or being on the side of white supremacists or something. The woke anger at Muslims spilled into the classroom. There have been these really interesting audio clips where all these teachers, who sound frankly like white blue-haired women to me, have berated young Muslim students for skipping LGBT-themed school events. Like, I'm disgusted with you, doesn't belong in our country, and so on. Basically saying you need to go back in some cases, which is funny because it's very much reminiscent of the alt-right. Another change here is on the far right, there's a growing sympathy for Islam. Converting to Islam has proven a viable mood for right-wing influence, or the way it would never been after 9/11. If you converted to Islam as a Fox News host in 2002, you're not going anywhere in the right. However, today, there are two right-wing influencers with large followings, Sneeko and Andrew Tate. Obviously, most right-wing, far-right personalities aren't about to convert to Islam the way Tate did and Sneeko did, but they speak respectfully about many qualities of it, what they see as its masculine, patriarchal character, and contempt for degeneracy. In other words, the white Sharia meme, though, is not entirely ironical. I think some of these people on the far right do admire elements of Islamic law and their treatment of homosexuals and so on. The Anglo-American Muslim community itself is undergoing an internal division and over liberalism versus traditionalism. Despite the backlash to LGBT in schools, which I talked about, a lot of Muslims have drunk the Kool-Aid and are left-wing now, basically, in the West. In the United States, most Muslims support gay marriage, as do political leaders like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. Nevertheless, there's a traditionalist backlash to these people that's brewing. And here is Muhammad Hijab, who's an interesting internet personality, a polemicist, can be a bit of a bully, but also is a smart guy. And he's very active in polemicizing against both liberalism and secularism, and as well as liberal Muslims. Hijab recently provoked controversy in the Anglo-American Muslim community by declaring that Humza Yousaf, First Minister of Scotland, is actually an apostate from Islam. He's a gentleman of South Asian descent. He said that homosexuality is not a sin, not just that it shouldn't be criminalized or whatever in a secular country, which he could have presumably gotten away with, but he made a theological statement. Nevertheless, the punishment is death under traditional Islam for apostasy. As the traditionalist backlash shows, and notwithstanding recent history in which Muslims were made the object of the political debate that ushered in the woke era, there's no guarantee that Muslims in the Anglo-American world will remain on the left. And in the 2024 election, we're going to see if, particularly in a state like Michigan, where Muslims actually are a numerically significant body of voters, whether Trump is able to appeal to them, tries to appeal to them, or whether they stay with the left. With Islamic history in there as well, the role of the Islam debate in creating the woke era. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to all of you soon.